This is the 6th annual Peter Hall lecture. We had to count back today. We don't keep a record of how many of these public lectures we've had, but it turns out the first one was in 2009, and this is the 6th in the series. Usually, this is the only public lecture that the school has every year, but many of you will know that we've actually had a centenary this year, so we've had a series of public lectures, and the annual Peter Hall lecture this evening is really the culmination of the centenary events that we've been running this year. In a moment, I will hand over to the Dean, Professor Alan Penn, who will introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Anne Markusen from the University of Minnesota. But I think normally, I've done a few of these now, I say a few words about why we have this particular annual lecture, which I'm sure most of you can guess. It's in honour of Peter's contribution to planning, to UCL, and his impact on the planning field. Next year we'll have a Peter Hall lecture again, obviously, but the centenary series, I hope you will agree, has been extremely successful this year, and it's more of a sort of, well, it's every month, or more or less every month, and it's an opportunity to bring people into UCL, entertain you a little bit, and introduce you to some of the best research going on in the field of planning worldwide. So we will maintain this public lecture series that we've initiated this year, but we will always culminate with the Peter Hall event. Now, for those of you who don't know Peter, which I'm sure is none of you at all, he has made a significant contribution to study of urban and regional planning over a number of years. I won't say many years, but a number of years. And if any of you happen to be unfamiliar with his work, I was browsing through The Planning Imagination this afternoon, which I'm sure many of you have come across, which is a book published last year, which is a celebration of Peter's various contributions to various aspects of planning over, can I say 40-year period, Peter?
Yeah,
I'm allowed to. Okay, I'm allowed to. So that's a really good starting point for those of you who are not familiar with Peter's back catalogue. If you want to actually delve into that in more detail, I believe there are around about 50 books, not including second editions and third editions and fourth editions, etc. But really, I think most of us here are familiar not only with Peter's written contribution to urban and regional planning, but to the impact that that work has had, which is not the norm, I think it's fair to say, in planning academia. Or certainly the level of impact that Peter has had over the years is not the norm. And I think, secondly, we're all very familiar as well with Peter's contribution to the School of Planning over a number of years. In terms of impact, Peter was quipping only yesterday that Boris Johnson wasn't the first person to dream up the idea of London's own big dig and basically suggest this orbital motorway under the city. I'm not sure if Peter was the progenitor of that idea, but we'll certainly be claiming it in the next Research Excellence Framework. So just a few months ago, well, actually it was last week, I think Peter said that it's, you know, we may be celebrating our centenary this year, and Peter said this, but his centenary is just 18 years away. We're all very hopeful that he will continue to make such a great and important contribution to the School of Planning during that period. I was hoping to see Magda this evening because I was hoping to sign a long-term contract for Peter's continuing availability to the school, but unfortunately she can't make it. But anyway, I'm going to hand over now to Alan Penn, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I'm not going to say very much, actually. I think it's a real testament both to Peter and to the 100 years of the School of Planning here that we're able to attract speakers of the stature of Anne Markusen. Anne is, I would guess, the preeminent person working on issues to do with the way that industries cluster, the way that they create cultures. And I don't know, I became familiar with her work on using words like sticky and slippery and so forth some while back. And it's really a great pleasure, we've never met before, to introduce Anne. I think that the nature of what's going on in London at the moment, where there's a city with a real buzz to it, which has happened really just over maybe the last five years, marked out perhaps with the 2012 Olympics and the kind of buzz that was created around that, but actually something which has been generated over the previous 20 years probably. And a lot of the essence of what's been going on in London seems to be captured by the kinds of questions that Anne addresses. What is it about creating places that creates creativity? What is it that makes innovation? How is it that human societies and cultures come together with the environments in which they exist and the economies that support them to make new stuff? And so I'm very much looking forward to hear what Anne's going to talk about today. Anne, of course, sorry, I should have said, comes from the University of Minnesota. She's actually moving on now to her own, she was telling me about this, her own sort of more entrepreneurial calling with the Markusen Economic Research. What is it?
That's it.
Organization.
It's a proprietorship.
Proprietorship. And I mean, she's been touring around various places north of here, and I think we'll be able to tell us some really interesting things about the nature of the way that new organisations and new cities are interacting. And this is something which I think is happening in a remarkably different way in this century than perhaps in previous centuries. So, Anne.
Thank you. Well, it's so wonderful to be here and to especially be in Peter's presence, and looking forward to our time together. And I'm going to tell a Peter story. I've never been able to tell this story in public, but I think now that the statute of limitations has passed, so I can tell the story. Peter and I were very lucky to be colleagues together at University of California. And it was just overjoying to me when he came because he was interested in the same things I was. And so I think maybe 2 of those books were co-authors on. At any rate, in about 1983 or 84, we were watching the huge Reagan defense buildup boom the California economy. And we decided that we should study why the defense industry was disproportionately in places like Los Angeles and, you know, Alabama and Texas, what we called the gun belt. So we decided to go to the National Science Foundation and ask for money to research this question about location of defense industries. Unlike Europe, where most of the defense aerospace is the same place as commercial, in the US it's a very different place. So, and we actually pitched, thanks to some of our graduate students who had pioneered this, that they should give us money to actually interview people who were responsible for moving companies to these places to find out why they really moved, rather than just looking at some kind of secondary data. And they funded us. So we had so much fun with our graduate students, Sabina Dietrich and Scott Campbell. We traveled around, went to Washington, D.C. We couldn't get into California. We couldn't get into the big companies until one of the other graduate students says, "Oh, my father works for Hughes. I'll call him up." And we got the red carpet. So anyway, to make a long story short, we wrote this book, The Rise of the Gun Belt. And we got a contract with Oxford University Press. And about 6 months into it, we were ready to send the whole thing. And for odd reasons, we hadn't signed the contract because we were still bargaining for a few things. We get a letter from Oxford, and it says, "The attached anonymous letter claims that your book is really a cover for secretly studying military bases in the United States. And because Peter Hall is married to a woman from Poland, they are sending this information to the Soviet Union," because it was, you know, via this conduit in Poland. "And as a result, we have to do a thorough legal review of your book, and you know, by the way, this is signed by a student who says they work on your project, but they're, for fear of retribution, they're not signing their name. So, I'm glad you're enjoying it. Can I go on with the story? Okay, so here we are, communist, you know, like infiltrators into the University of California. So we had a meeting, and Peter was so distraught, and I remember you were banging your fist on the table like, we've got to root this out. We've got to figure out who this is. I said, Peter, you know, he's head of the Institute for Urban Regional Development. I said, there are at least like 40 employees just in this institute, and, you know, there's 150 graduate students here. You know, if we start suspecting people, we're going to be in big trouble. And then we figured, well, actually, whoever this person is, who was probably some crazy wacky, in Berkeley there are a lot of crazy wacky people, just really wanted to hurt us for some reason. And so our best strategy was to completely take a pact that we wouldn't tell a soul about this. So we took this pact, we did not tell anybody about it. You know, I kept negotiating with Oxford and just saying, like, why do you have to do a legal review? They just said, we do. 6 months later, they write us and they say, you're cleared. Your book goes ahead. So, but it was a very, very kind of distressing thing for us at the time to really feel that vulnerable, like somebody's attacking you, you don't know who they are. Anyway, wonderful colleagueship. I really thank you for those years. I am, for the last decade, have been working on arts and culture. And although I worked on industries my whole life, I made a switch in the early part of the last decade to studying employment by looking at occupations as well as industries. And I needed a test case. I always like to use my laboratory as my, you know, my backyard as my laboratory. I decided to study artists because I had moved back to my hometown of Minneapolis, St. Paul after, you know, 35 years. And I could see that the ranks of artists had really grown and all different kinds of artists were overrepresented for the size of our workforce. So I decided to study artists. And since then, I feel like this has been very self-indulgent because after 15 years of, you know, interviewing defense contractors and serving on a presidential commission with the CEOs of Lockheed and Boeing, it was a really different experience and a very joyful experience. So what I'm going to present tonight is really a looking forward research agenda about arts and culture in cities. And I've done a lot of research and published it. I'm not really going to cover that. You'll see little snippets of things in there. But it's an attempt to really encourage some of you to work on this very, very interesting sector and to work on it in perhaps new ways. So briefly, I'm going to talk about Creative Cities work. But I thought the lecture was, you know, like an hour and a half. And I love to have discussion. So I'm going to make that very, very short. But I am going to just say a little bit about it because it's been going on for about 20 or 30 years, but kind of under the radar. But it has just exploded in the last decade in Europe, in the United States, and in other countries of the world. I'm going to concentrate on what are the urban missions of arts and culture, which will probably surprise a lot of you, my suggestions about that. I'm going to ask a little bit about location. Why are artists, arts organizations, and arts participants cited where they are, and does it have something to do with the availability of culture in each other? And I'm going to finish by talking about what are the equity dimensions of urban arts and culture. And I realized I was going to take out the location and make it a postscript, but now I'm trying to put it in the middle, but it'll be brief. Okay, creative cities. How many people really know anything about the creative city literature? Just raise your hands. So, oh, good. Well, like 12, a dozen people. Okay. I'm going to really underscore a few things that people don't know that much about. As far as I can tell, the earliest piece of work that was really done by a planner is this book, The Arts and the Economic Life of the City, by Harvey Perloff. So switch that around. And about 30 of his colleagues and students. Harvey Perloff was Dean of the College of Architecture and Planning at UCLA, somebody Peter knew well, and I did as well. And this was an outstanding study that looked in many different nuanced ways at the interaction between art and culture in the city. And one great outcome of it was also published in Cultural Economics, by the way. One of the outcomes of this was that Joel Wax, who was the brother of one of the, Marty Wax, who was also a faculty member in the School of Architecture and Planning, was on the city council in LA, and he was a Republican, and he single-handedly pushed through a hospitality tax that has been funding a very ample cultural affairs department in the city of Los Angeles for 30 years. 90 people work in their cultural affairs department, which isn't true of any other city except New York. Another very important and higher visibility one, for some reason, I don't know why, this Perloff work has never really gotten the visibility it deserves, kind of nationally and internationally. However, this report done by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the arts as an industry, their economic importance to the New York, New Jersey region, did get a lot of play. And it was a much narrower study. It was really about economic impact, the arts as an instrument. And of course, in Europe, there was this very interesting early work by really a team of Brits and Germans, and Italians for that matter. The early work of Franco Bianchini and Charles Landry Bianchini and Klaus Kunzmann, who I worked with also with in the 90s, really looking at the creative city. And their idea was very much about revitalization. So they were really looking at arts and culture as a way. Klaus was living in Bochum and he was teaching in Dortmund, and he was really distressed about deindustrialization, trying to figure out ways that, turning to arts and culture, they could really, breathe some life back into these towns and cities. There's also quite a bit on creative industries, occupations, and the creative class, which I'm not going to go into because they're probably more familiar to you. But I wanted to say a little bit about this very wonderful paper that Peter wrote called Creative Cities and Economic Development in Urban Studies. So like Peter, he breezes into this field, and he brings the depth of intellectual history to it in a way that nobody else has. And I love this piece because he really asks a big question. Why have some cities in history been more creative than others? The book comes from his work on his book, Cities and Civilization. And at the very beginning, he also cites Keynes, and I really love this, where he says, Keynes made this droll remark, in the 20s or 30s, like, well, right now we still have to scrabble for our livelihoods, but maybe in the future we'll have much more leisure time and we'll all be able, because technology will take us so far. Yeah, right. Okay, but anyway, Peter's book underscores that creative industry work has not addressed the question of vocation, and I'll come back to that because I think that's a very acute comment. But the most interesting thing to me is what Peter actually says about creativity in cities. And he takes us, on a romp through, Athens and what other places did you do?
Florence.
Florence, right, and so on and so forth. And actually what he ends up telling us, very Peter-like, because he's really attentive to the idea of creators and individuals in history, that there were groups of individuals in these places who were outsiders in the sense that they weren't born in the city, they were kind of born in maybe peripheral towns, and they came to the city, and they were in a way somewhat marginal. They really weren't part of the life of the city, and that marginality really helped them to innovate in ways that nobody had thought before, and he includes people like Shakespeare, Einstein, Picasso, Shostakovich. So, and I think that's a very, very interesting argument. I'm not playing on that field myself, but I kind of wish I were, and I really appreciate the piece very much. Okay, I have really changed almost completely my view about why arts and culture are important, and this may sound foreign to a lot of you, but I did really start as an economist saying, wow, look at how underappreciated arts and culture are in terms of their contributions to industry and cities and so on. And that has been the recent emphasis for the last 10 years, revitalization, economic impact, and tourism. And there has been quite a bit of investment, both in physical capacity, and you'll see some in this talk, and the City of Cultural competitions in Europe and in the UK, festivals and so on. And also there's been some real interest in cultural districts and some debate about that. The idea, should cities concentrate their cultural offerings in a single place or spread them out, have them be more diverse, dispersed, etc. This is just an example of my city, Jean Nouvel, our new Guthrie Theater, which I've written a scathing critique of on many, many fronts in a piece that I think is in here that I'll cite later. Another interesting example of a failure, Urbis in Manchester, opportunistic, got a lot of money, put up a building, don't think that much about programming. And there was some very, very fine programming there, not right away, but after a few years, but it was kind of too late to make it work. It was empty for 3 years and unused, and now it is a National Football Museum, which was pulled out of another city, Preston, in order to move it there. So we'll see whether that works. This is a more successful case Sage Gateshead Music Center, also monumental building, which was supposed to have development happen all around it, but that hasn't occurred, private sector development. But it's had really, really brilliant programming, where a lot of what's offered is not in the concert hall, but in the foyer. I didn't bring the pictures, but the foyer is turned into a jazz lounge. People are hanging all over balconies, and in the summer they do rock and roll outside, you know, on the patio by the river. So they really serve lots and lots of different constituencies. And here's an example from the Ruhr Valley, turning old steel mills into performance spaces and so on. Now, in the United States, I don't know how prominent this is here, although because I spent 7 months here a couple of years ago as a UK Distinguished Chair at the Glasgow School of Art, I was able to network with quite a few people, including the people at Nesta, where I gave a talk and so on. But there's been a big emphasis on the instrumental value of of arts and culture, which is the extent to which arts and culture really produce jobs and incomes in their region, you know, are connected to export industries and so on and so forth. My first piece was very much like this, the artistic dividend, which I made 4 different arguments and marshaled some evidence about how important artists are as contributors to regional economies. And Americans for the Arts, the whole arts establishment in the United States has really turned to these instrumental arguments about how great arts are for creating jobs, et cetera. And this group, the Americans for the Arts, puts out every year a massive economic impact report, and they package it for every state so all the advocates can go out to the state legislature and so on. I want to say that I think the popularity of this is quite opportunistic and a response to the very terrible culture wars that we had in the United States. So in the early 90s, and I won't go into it, we had a series of artists who were funded by the NAA, mostly performing artists, but also visual artists like Robert Mapplethorpe, who were doing very provocative work. The work was really all about the AIDS crisis, but nobody really got that or understood it. And we had a Republican Congress, and they slashed the NAA budget to almost nothing. There really isn't any national funding at all for artists, and corporations kind of followed suit. So we had a huge implosion in funding for the arts because of this controversy. And one way that arts advocates climbed out of it was by turning to these instrumental arguments about the arts. So very, very interesting history. Actually, there's a great paper that's been published recently in Grantmakers for the Arts by a protagonist. I also was put in this awkward position. First, I was asked to write the creative placemaking white paper for the National Endowment for the Arts, which was a blissful, wonderful experience. I think when I was here 3 years ago, I spoke about this at UCL. But once they implemented these big, you know, grants that were competitive for creative placemaking to cities, and the head of the NTA went out and put together big pots of funding from big foundations by going right to the top of the foundations, and also various other departments in Washington, and started funding projects. And our report had called for metrics or something like that, or valuation. I found that they were using the most ridiculous kinds of evaluation and indicators. And I wrote this rant, and I just was blown away. I think the most powerful things I've ever written, I've written out of a sense of pique, which is really true of my fuzzy concepts paper and my sticky places, just like some really distress about where a literature was that I thought was off base. So this was the case, and I really recommend it. First, it came out just as a blog and this thing that young people are doing in the US. It was picked up by Grantmakers in the Arts, which is the the organization for all grants arts funders in the US, and then it was reprinted in this new International Journal of Urban Sciences. And this is what the fellow who ran the blog put on, with my blog the very first time. And he has a quote from Ansel Adams: "There's nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept," from Ansel Adams. So anyway, and I love the sign. I made the sign but had nothing to say. And I'm very proud to say that this piece caused an uproar, and basically it changed the whole course of how evaluation is done by these two organizations. One of them, our place, completely abandoned what they were doing, and NEA, because they have to, because of the bean counting thing and the federal government, they have to show something. And they actually commissioned an Urban Institute study, which ended up saying, well, there are only 3 indicators that you might be able to use, but you have to be very careful. And of course, the biggest reason is because there are a lot of other things happening in the same neighborhoods that are affecting outcomes, and so you can't just use secondary data and put it together. But anyway, I really recommend my rant. my rant of the decade. Now, at a deeper level, I really have come to understand that these arguments about economic impact from the point of view of funding and legislatures and so on are extremely weak. And I've been arguing for 5 years with our arts advocates. Because if you just ask yourself this question, do engineers have to go to the legislature and say, every dollar you spend on an engineer creates another job and another dollar? No, you don't, because people know what infrastructure is. They know they need it. And the same thing goes for medicine, the same thing goes for science. In fact, scientists are able to go and say, you have to just trust us. This might not work out, that would be okay, but we really, in the long run, we're gonna make great progress. So I think the real project for people in arts and culture is to try to reestablish a language around the intrinsic value of the arts. And there's some very good work going on about this. One of them is a great study called The Gifts of the Muse by Kevin McCarthy, Elizabeth Hennigan, Ondaatje, Laura Zacharias, and Arthur Brooks. And it's a very, very careful, considered, complex, long piece that they published about a decade ago. And it has been very thoughtfully read by lots of people. So I'm going to just talk about some intrinsic values of the arts, which I'm not an expert on, but I appreciate. I've been hanging out with artists and art school deans, and I just gave my first ever commencement address to a school of art. So beauty, that is one of the roles of art. This happens to be Sherwood Chen, who's a Taiwanese-American dancer. He does Buto, which is a Japanese form of dance, but he also innovates with it. From San Francisco, this is Marcus Shelby, who's a big band jazz composer and director playing one of my very favorite art forms. There's Delight. This is Jeff Raz. He's a San Francisco clown who makes a good living at it. Or young music. We have lots of young international music in the US. Manish and his friends doing music in LA. Humor. This is a printmaker from Minnesota who does a whole series on cowboys, making fun of cowboys. I wish I had bought this print when I first saw it, which was about 12 years ago. Now I can't afford it. My vices were magnificent. Innovation. There are some wonderful things written now about how artists actually figured out things, big breakthroughs in science before scientists ever did. And we just had 2 papers, and we had a big conference last year on 3 million artists. But I'll give you an example of how cities are doing this in a very active way. This is in San Jose, California, which aspires to be the capital of Silicon Valley. San Jose actually has a deficit of artists in its labor force. And so a number of years ago, I did a creative entrepreneurship project with the city, along with a woman who had been doing training for artists for a long time. But also the city has been funding, well, at first they funded, and now they don't have to fund it anymore, an amazing biennial every 2 years. The first one was in 2006. The idea is to marry art and technology. It's called 01. And their idea is that this is the future of Silicon Valley, that increasingly what's on the content of your iPhone or your computer is really about visualization, hearing, speech, music, etc. And they don't have that kind of talent. And also, in a deeper sense, they really believe that artists can bring them ideas about the future and strategy that their engineers and geeks don't necessarily have. So this happens to be their art car parade. So they commission artists from all over the world and Silicon Valley every 2 years to produce these proposals to do an artwork that's about linking art and technology. And this is their green car parade they have actually. So artists designed, at the end they go to the convention center and everybody can come all weekend and ask them questions. And this has morphed in the longer run into, and by the way, they use all the arts venues in the city as the platforms for this, which is cool for the arts organizations because it means lots of people go in and out their doors and know where they are and what they're doing. Now they have the 01 Garage, which is actually a space run by the same nonprofit organization that runs the biennial, where they are getting engineers, scientists, and artists together, and they're also placing artists in some of the bigger companies in Silicon Valley. So it'll be very interesting to see what the outcome of this is. Challenge, artist challenges. This is Paul Bowden Rodriguez, a professional friend of mine who has grown up in this Latino Catholic culture, struggling with it as a gay man, doing these wonderful performances about it, very challenging to his audiences. Political and social critique and protest. wonderful cartoonist in the Bay Area, African-American Keith Knight. And he's done these wonderful things. He runs, I don't know if you get the Funny Times, but there's this, you can get this, newspaper every month that's got great cartoons in it from all the cartoonists all over the world. And anyway, he has quite a series and quite a following. This is just one of his examples. By the way, I once heard a wonderful paper presented by an American Studies professor about how cartoonists had translated the absurdity of the Reagan proposal to build his Star Wars, to build a big, roof over the United States so we could not be invaded by nuclear weapons. And he showed all these cartoons at this conference. And he said these cartoons are responsible for getting the word out, translating what scientists had done out to the American public so they really got it. And of course, Star Wars never happened. And protests. This is a Hanuri. This is a Korean American group in Los Angeles using their traditional music as a part of an immigration protest and parade. Artists and art are wonderful mirrors on ourselves and our society. This is a book written by Elizabeth Partridge, a Berkeley-based writer, about John Lennon, and it's aimed at high school students to really help them understand, the significance of someone like John Lennon and what a model he was for how he chose to live his life. And also film. This is a documentary film written about the New York Dolls. Does anybody here remember the New York Dolls? Oh, they're great. You're even young. So this is a great film by Seth Gordon about a former New York doll he found in the streets of LA, just really down and out and poor. And he followed him for a while, and he helped them have a reunion of the dolls here, and they performed in the UK. And then he actually unexpectedly died. It's all in a wonderful documentary. So again, just for us in the 60s, kind of recouping part of our history. And remembering our history in deeper ways. We have lots of late Native Americans in the United States. I've done a big study of Native American artists just in my state with a Native American writer partner. And this is a wonderful caricature of Fort Snelling, which is now in the middle of Minneapolis, and was where the US government kind of came and imposed soldiers on what was a Native American place, sacred place, actually. And he uses satire in a wonderful way. This is Edward Curtis, the photographer, paparazzi. He would call them paparazzi. In fact, some of his paintings are called that. Wonderful creative stuff. And this is by Laura Youngbird from the Ojibwe tribe in northern Minnesota. This is a remembrance of the boarding schools that her parents and grandparents had to go to, were forcibly taken to. One of my friends, who's almost my age, went to boarding schools from grade 1 through 6, and just really explaining about assimilation. This is called assimilation dress and confirmation suit. Just about that experience, helping us remember that. Carol Charney, a wonderful art director, actually at advertising in San Francisco, but has quite an art practice, photography herself, and this is her Holocaust series that she does, which doesn't sell well at galleries, but does very well with museums, and then she has a more abstract form. And Marcus Shelby, one more time, really creating not only a space in San Francisco for both performance and making money and teaching about jazz, but also has been doing these amazing oratorios, which he gets funding for. This one is about the death of 300 African-American sailors. They were in the American Navy during World War II at a huge ammunition explosion while loading a boat in the San Francisco Bay Area. And because the other workers that didn't die protested the health and safety conditions, they were all given dishonorable discharges by the US Navy. This oratorio, which went around from community to community in the Bay Area, and they found still some living men from this experience, resulted in the US Navy reinstating the honorable discharges of these people and, I think helping to some extent those few that were left. Very powerful roles. And finally, understanding diverse cultures and human conditions. We have a lot of diversity in our country, and we have a lot of continued racism and balkanization and a lot of spatial residential sorting. This is Hirosaku Kosaka. He is a 5th generation Buddhist monk, and he's the artistic director at the Japanese Cultural Center in Los Angeles, and he's doing a performance piece. And he's also designed the little Tokyo station, transit station, et cetera. And this is a really unusual group. This is a group of Filipina lesbian women who, because their families just could not understand what they were doing, decided to create a performance group and to do all these performances around being, young lesbian Filipinas. Really interesting story. I want to say that there are ways to really evaluate these intrinsic value of the arts. And I think they're these intrinsic values are a lot of reasons that young people come to big cities. It's not just all about, the opportunity to get jobs, et cetera. It's a part of the richness of the life in places like this. And this wonderful consultant, Alan Brown, has done wonderful, wonderful work really trying to begin to measure the intrinsic value of the arts by asking people when they come out of performances about things like their emotional experience, what they learned, about what the subject matter was, and so on. Being a total theater freak myself, I really love this piece. And Alan Brown and I have written a separate piece I'm not going to talk about tonight about how participation is changing too. Okay, I'm going to say just a little bit about location. I have a much longer piece on this in an article coming out in the Journal of Urban Affairs. But since Peter raised it in his piece, I thought I would just say, this to me is one of the biggest missing things in this whole creative cities thing. Basically, I'm going to contend that although we know a fair amount about where artists live and where arts organizations are, and we know something about where arts participants live, at least organizations, they do this polling, they know that the 5 zip codes around them or where the people who come to their theater are from. We basically don't know anything about their locational calculus. And that's odd because we know so much about location in the cities, in retail, in business organizations, and so on and so forth. And I'm just really proposing that we learn how do artists move and live where they do. They're really, really just differential rates, and the growth rates of artists. These just happen to be in the big recession period. And the interesting thing is, I love this because my city, Minneapolis, had the biggest gain in the ranks of artists during the huge, we took a huge hit in this period, 2006 to 2009. These cities, which have the much higher concentrations of artists, just kind of held even, and some cities lost a lot. It's just, but we need to know why. And it's not just that artists migrate, which they do. So here are the migration figures. Unfortunately, we don't have this question in the census anymore, but we did in 2000. So 2 artists arrived in LA for everyone that left. And for Minneapolis, St. Paul, Boston, it was just kind of, as many came as left. And both some fast-growing cities like San Jose and Houston had big net out-migration of artists, but also some of the older industrial cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and so on. And I'd like to point out that Minneapolis, St. Paul actually gained a lot of artists in this period. So what does that mean? It means we home grew more artists than other places. So the ranks of your artists increase not just because you have more people arrive than leave, but also because you home grow artists. And we have, I think, extraordinary institutions that explain that. Also, there's a very interesting age-related migration. This is true actually for young people in general, but it's more market for artists. So the purple is the Twin Cities, which is, 3 million people in a state that's 5 million people. So the yellow is the out-migration from all the rest of Minnesota, and the maroon, which is the University of Minnesota color, is the net in-migration. So obviously at young ages, big net in-migration to the Twin Cities. Some of it could come from other states also. But there's a reverse migration in mid-career, which is interesting. I have lots of speculation. I've written a fair amount about that, and also over 65. So there's a lot of ferment in the lives of artists. In general, young people who don't live in the city come to cities for educations, and many of them go back, or many of them who are from the city decide, especially writers and visual artists that work alone, that they're real advantages to live in the countryside. Finally, there's just a huge amount of really interesting mapping we could do. This is my favorite map I've ever created, which is of Los Angeles. I did a big study of artists in California, but these are the mapping from the census, and it just shows how dense residentially artists are in these areas around Hollywood, and also by different art forms. So one of the oddities is generally writers are more, suburbanized, not than the workforce as a whole, but then other kinds of artists. But here, because screenwriting is so central, to get a chance to do screenwriting, you have to be really, really kind of connected and in there. And just really interesting differences across the whole area. So, and then we have other questions that I'm not going to really, how do arts organizations locate where they do? And I've only done one piece of work on this, which I thought was just totally mind-blowing. Peter will appreciate this because it's about California. I did a big study of the arts ecology in California, which was about arts organizations. And one of the things we found is that the Bay Area and Los Angeles, they have more numbers of arts organizations than other places. But on a per capita basis, the number of arts organizations per capita is actually highest in these northern, rather rural parts of California and in the mountains. And they're particularly low in the poor Central Valley agricultural areas, which actually has a very bifurcated income distribution with wealthy farmers and lots and lots and lots and lots of farm workers. So I think that would be very interesting to really, people are very intrigued by this, trying to figure out why there are more arts organizations per capita there. We think it's because people are paid for a diversified set of small capacity in all the different arts forms. And where do our patrons take into account arts and cultural offerings where they decide to live? We know this is really important anecdotally, that especially older people in the United States now are getting rid of these suburban homes with the huge space and maintenance costs and everything else and moving back to cities. It's just a huge phenomenon. I think it is to some extent in Europe as well. And one of the reasons is because they can be really near, the Dakota Jazz Club, the Guthrie Theater, all these other, arts offerings that they can actually walk to through skyways all winter long because all buildings are connected with these, overhead corridors, so you don't have to go out in the cold. But it's just a very interesting question. And again, I've written this piece that'll be out this summer in Journal of Urban Affairs where I've really posed a lot of questions about these phenomena. So the final thing I wanted to talk about today was really equity. We call it equity, you call it inclusion. I feel very nervous about inclusion in my particular subject area because I think it's not a question so much of inclusion as in broadening the notion of arts and culture. So I'm going to be talking about that. In the American Planning Academy, there's been a lot of interest in recent years in the whole question of equity and justice. And really the major new work is Susan Feinstein's wonderful book, The Just City, which came out in 2010, and which goes back through Rawls and all the other theories of justice and really poses some very, very interesting challenges. One of the ones that I think is most interesting is that she really takes apart there are differences in having a norm of equity, a norm of diversity, and the norms of democracy. And she really explores those in a very wonderful way. I'd like you to just read this quote. And it's a quote, I think, that very nicely takes on the creative placemaking thing. So there you have it. Roberto Bedoya is the executive director of the Pima Arts Council, which is the Tucson area, metropolitan area of the U.S., which is one of the very fast-growing areas in the U.S. And it's a very wonderful piece, and he's done some wonderful work. So why do we have this problem? And I think, our problem is very similar to your problem, but maybe it's not a problem for you. But in a society where we have so many immigrants, it is really a problem for us. And one of them is just elite funding and governance structures. Most of our arts and cultural offerings are provided by nonprofit organizations. That's quite different than Europe. And they really don't have accountability. They have self-replicating boards. They get enormous tax breaks from government, both for themselves and for the people who donate money, but there's no accountability the way there would be if it were public sector funding. And so there tends to be a re-replication of, huge, beautiful buildings, which are actually playgrounds of the rich. And in this piece that Noah Isserman and I wrote together, we really talked about these narratives and how bigger is better in the arts world still really dominates at the level of these large arts organizations and their patrons. I could say some nice things about the LA Music Center, but I don't do them in this particular talk. And the other is the Eurocentrism in artistic conventions. And for us, this is a very, very big problem. And because in the 19th century, when we had a new bourgeoisie, they wanted to do exactly what you have here. They built, concert halls like Wagner's. They built art institutes. They built symphony halls. And now we're having big crises. A lot of our orchestras are failing outright, and or downsizing. We just did both of our two orchestras in our city were on lockout for a year and a half, and they're barely recovering. But I think the bigger thing for us is that we have these new arts forms like jazz. Jazz is a completely African-American creation It's got very complex, interesting roots. It's a very brilliant art form. It took decades and decades to even be accepted by American universities as something that could be taught at the university level. And finally, thanks to the Marsalis brothers, we have a concert hall at Lincoln Center for Jazz. And that's a huge, huge achievement. And since I've been working with Native American artists, I'm just going to show some of the extraordinary work that these people's art forms, the beadwork they do, the work they do with leather, the performances that they have. These are community things that everybody in the community, I have another picture of the men dancing, but sometimes they dance together. Every age of person, everybody participates, and some members of the tribe make these beautiful garments, and you know, they are paid for by other people, but they're not considered to be art. This is an amazing beadworker. Marcy McIntyre lives way up by the Canadian border. And the third is really this ongoing distinction between art and craft, which there's endless debates about in the United States, and I'm not really that interested in them, but between informal and formal sectors, between professional and amateur, you know, art makers. And these are just some examples, again, from a parade in San Jose, which is a very, very ethnically complex place, and in a little town in Louisiana where they've taken both Creole music and Cajun music, put them together around French language. They have French language speakers there, reviving the French language and building around music and art. It's a long story. So here are some questions in this particular part of the agenda. And there are a bunch of questions, so you could read them, but I'll just sort of maybe say one word about each one. So what about class, age, or cultural divisions within ethnic, racial, and immigrant groups? So we have some very, very huge immigrant groups in some parts of the United States. And there are, in Santa Ana, California, we have a very poor but just robust Latino organization, El Centro Cultural, and it's been displaced 6 times by its all-Latino city council that just wants to have art students and, you know, to prettify the downtown with gentrification. It's a very interesting story. One of my students is writing a dissertation on it. Hierarchies inside participatory or informal cultural groups. We did 30 or 40 case studies in California along with our California Ecology study. We insisted that our funder do that so we could learn something about these smaller arts organizations. We found lots of dysfunction in smaller groups, probably not more than in the big groups, but nevertheless there. When there are diverse cultural groups, in Santa Ana, California, which is a huge suburb in Orange County of LA, there are huge Vietnamese populations and huge Latino populations. Do they work together? Do they compete? Do some of the same, like the things for young spoken words, serve both communities, or just one or the other? And how does that work? Ongoing arts and cultural programming. What kinds of things happen in these communities? Most immigrant communities have festivals every year and parades in which they make beautiful garments for and they perform amazing music, but are they just kind of one-off things, or do things happen continuously? You know, I understand that there are huge Chinese churches, there are actually churches where there's celebrations all day on Sunday, every day of the week, and huge numbers of people come. Immigrant connections with home country arts and culture. The same group in Santa Ana, El Centro Cultural, has strong relationships with Veracruz, Mexico. People left behind in Veracruz, so to speak, are impoverished. They are ordering costumes and instruments from them and marketing them all over the United States, so keeping that connection. And they're taking their own innovation, like their young people are doing hip hop, and they take that back to Veracruz, and they try to work with people to say, it's really okay, you've got to accept these new art forms, etc. Ethnic dispersal over time, kind of the history in the United States, probably here as well. After a second or third generation, it happened with Italians, now it's happening with Latinos. People get more prosperous, they get educations, they begin moving out of the centers of urban areas. What does that do to the cultural institutions that really have been a part of where their kind of immigrant enclave is? What about space for low-income groups? We found in our study of these 40 organizations, I think they were, that most of them beg, borrow, or sometimes rent space from other organizations. They don't have their own rental agreements, and they don't have their own space, and they use public parks and streets a lot. What role do city planners, politicians, and developers play in shaping arts and cultural spaces and offerings for these groups of people? I think it's the rare city that does a good job of that. That's what we could say. How do funders view and support diverse and low-income arts organizations? I'd say that's been a very tough road, but there's more discussion about it now in the arts funding community. What role does urban space and its features play in shaping arts and cultural spaces and offerings? Public land and spaces and streets have been very, very important to lower income people, using their own arts forms, and that's interesting. And then also the role of city planning. And what is the relationship between mainstream arts organizations and small ethnic, immigrant, and working class groups? And I would say, for the most part, there's very little. One of the problems is that studying these forms, these really diverse forms of arts and culture, is very difficult because the data is very thin, it's often misleading, and it's hard to generate. And here's just an example for you. We were asked to do the study in California with this new cultural data project, Data, which is funded by a foundation and has built a whole machine around this where they collect data from arts organizations because we don't have government data on nonprofit organizations the same way we do in a competitive marketplace for-profit organizations. They're studied all the time because stockholders want to know, are they worth investing in, et cetera. So we used these data, and as soon as we got these data for California, we realized they way underrepresented the small organizations. So actually, we went to the IRS data at the federal level, and we were able to use the IRS data to show that the actual shares, that about 80% of all the arts organizations in California were, 48% of them were under $25,000 a year in budget, and another, 30%, 38% were under $250,000. So this accounted for a very large share of the actual arts organizations, but in this, CDP data set, it was very skewed to the larger organizations, and this is the coverage rates, and you can just see the difference. So huge coverage, like 40% of coverage. This is a voluntary thing, by the way. It's not a sample, it's a voluntary thing, so lots of people don't participate. But 40% of the big organizations did, but only about 3% of the really small ones did. So that's a problem. We also were able to show that these small organizations were disproportionately in ethnic, folk arts, and multidisciplinary, and humanities, legacy, and other museums. Whereas, the biggest ones were in visual arts, media, music, and so on. So we also did do something really fun with these data that we got, and that was that the CDP did tell us how many volunteers there were for each of these organizations and how many staff people, paid staff people there were. So we were able to compute these ratios of volunteers to staff. So think what the significance of this is. If you are more or less judging arts organizations' impact by how big their budget is, you're going to really, really underestimate the impact of these small organizations, because some of them, like here's the spoken word organization in Santa Ana, it has school teachers that give their time for free in the summer. They don't pay themselves a cent, including the guy that runs the whole thing. They affect many, many young people's lives. They raise enough money for the kind of paper and transportation to competitions they need. $5,000 a year is their budget. But their impact, because they have 40 different teachers participating, is much, much huger than that. So this also led us into a very interesting discussion with professionals around the United States about how to measure the size of an arts organization, including some fascinating things about revenue versus expenditures. So that really leaves us with this question. These are my agendas I would really like to see us do in this creative placemaking world. I think there's a tremendous amount of work. I really haven't talked about my creative placemaking work, but we did a wonderful job, I thought, of really doing some fast case studies and picking out finished examples that, as the chair of the NAA said, it's fine if you do case studies, but because we said we have to do some research in 5 months, but you have to have big industrial cities, suburban western cities, smaller cities, little tiny towns. You have to have every art form. You have to have everything. So we did, and we drew all these implications out. And I think the framing of that and the way that the NEA the NEA was headed in this 4-year period of time by a Broadway producer who really knew how to raise money and really knew how to get publicity. And he's made a huge difference because now every city in small town in the US wants to do this creative placemaking. And because they all don't get funded, some of them just say, we're going to do it anyway. So that's very, very exciting. But there are all these issues. We don't really know that much about location. We aren't doing a very good job. We still have this very lopsided, set of conventions about art and what art is. And we have a lot of conflict, actually, around gentrification in some places and really trying to figure out what do we really want out of these creative placemaking exercises. Do we want just appreciation and land value? That was one of the, the indicators I picked apart. Home ownership. Oh, you want home ownership rates to go up? What does that mean? Not only are you discriminating against renters and poorer people, but a lot of young people don't own. A lot of young hip people that you say you want, they don't own. So why are you using an indicator? Or how about this one? The percent of cell phone usage on Saturday night. Oh, I said, oh, that's really interesting. So anybody who's going to a jazz concert or the theater, they're going to have their cell phone turned off. So all you're really going to capture are all those young people hanging out in the pubs and everything else. I don't have an objection to that, but it's not a very good indicator for arts patronage. So just a little thing on that. So I wanted to have a conversation with you. So the floor is open, not just for questions, but disagreement or comments or any other thing you'd like to raise about this whole wonderful area of work that I am enjoying doing so much.
Thank you, Anne. I mean, you seem to, you're sort of chairing yourself, so...
Is that okay?
But, obviously, we have plenty of time for questions. Start?
Well, Anne, I suppose I should kick this one off. I do have some very other funny stories about...
Would you get up and just face everybody so everybody can hear you?
Yeah.
Please, and that goes for anybody else. Please identify yourself, but Peter, we know who he is.
I do have another very funny stories about how in academia we run up against various problems like what we did with the gun belt, including the time I was a lecturer, started Enterprise Zones and the Heritage Foundation, which is a respectable right-of-centre think tank in Washington, D.C., whose director happened to be Scottish. Stuart Butler invited me to a meeting, and this was revealed by a guy called Lyndon LaRouche. Now, you remember Lyndon LaRouche? Not that, how many other people in your audience would know this name? Anyway, he was a virulent, I don't know what to call him, right-wing conspiracy theory, and he produced a thing saying that this conference was a conspiracy to sell into the enterprise zone theory as an international drug conspiracy between me and the Queen of England. People took it very seriously and said, you've got to get FBI protection, which I declined. And it was okay, because shortly afterwards, Lyndon LaRouche was jailed for a very long period for, I think, tax fraud and very other rackets, so that was okay, but that wasn't the main point. I think there are 2 points you raised, Anne. Not in this fascinating part at the end, but at the beginning. I mean, the one being, in this country, we've been very big recently in the universities. Half the people in the audience are probably scarred by this, Alan above all, by impact. We're required to demonstrate the impact of our research. And this isn't an easy matter, but it's being driven by a business agenda on the part of government. That's saying, what are universities for? Universities are there to generate money, to help UK PLC, and they justify themselves if you can prove that the research spun off a lot of commercial stuff and in turn generated jobs, which is very live now because we're having this huge fight, of course, between Pfizer and AstraZeneca. Anyway, main point, I think that some of this comes from the fact that there was this interest which we shared, that's when we came together, in Technopolis programs. This led on to the work which Manuel Castells and I did. And there was a huge interest 20 years ago in the idea that technical development would research would spin off new jobs. And this is spreading, and in this country it's still alive. It may not be such a debate in the US, but it's not really certain that we could even show this. Perhaps we could in some cases. And certainly, as we know, it's a lot harder for this. So it may be a hiding to nothing, but you can see where we're going. The other point, and you know this well because you've done the research here, is that unlike the US, where much of this was driven by foundations, here it was driven by city governments like Manchester, which blew Urbis, and Sheffield, which blew the National Museum of Popular Music, and other places that did rather better. It's been a publicly driven enterprise, but with the same idea of reviving the economy. And of course that great scheme in Germany, in the Enscher Park, which is, were you there on that occasion? I think
no, I wasn't there on the occasion, but I've been there.
Anyway, class took us round 20 years ago.
Yeah.
The place was rusting away, terrible. And he said, what do we do with this? Someone said, it could have been me if something said, a light and sound show. And bingo, next thing we knew, it was fantastically successful. But the point here, this is, as with, I think, a point you made with Sage and the Baltic down the road, it's mainly consumption. It's to boost the urban economy through massive consumption and bring in the tourists. And there's some stuff down there in Sage where the kids are doing stuff, and that's important. So there's creation as well. But the real question is, what's all this for? Is it just to boost the urban tourist economy? The last point, you made the point that in Sage they haven't been successful in generating real estate. And this is the other, of course, big issue. Is it a device for boosting real estate? Now, it happens, I'll stop now. Last semester, I had 30 presentations in urban regeneration, and I think half of them were from Chinese students. And they were fascinating, they were brilliant. I'm sure many of the students are here, but they all tended to be the same presentation. And they showed a city, it was always a different city, and there was this tremendous cultural centre initiative, which very rapidly turned into a total real estate racket, to develop a lot of real estate commercially, and the artists were all pushed out, of course. In a few cases, I think the officials who'd done this were jailed, in a few cases not. But it was a general pattern, you know, and it's very, very big in China, and possibly in some other cases. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that aspect.
Well, yeah, I'll comment on two things. Actually, the thing about consumption, I think, is really important. And I think it's a good thing. So I've been trying to explain this, too, to all these cities who think that if they build a Guthrie Theater, tourists will come, because the answer is they aren't. So you have to build your arts and cultural capacity for your own people. First of all, because of the argument Greg Schrock and I make about distinctiveness. Nashville didn't start, oh, we're going to create an export-based industry. No, people started migrating there because it was a country music place, and it grew and grew and grew and grew. And then it became attractive to other people. So in a lot of small towns in the US, it's amazing what people have done by just building an artist center, a place for people to congregate and come and enjoy themselves. And it's not aimed at tourism. It's aimed at people in the surrounding counties. And one artist who had moved to a small town like this, which is like 4 hours away from Minneapolis, St. Paul, went to the city council and said, why don't we take one of these beautiful old Victorian buildings that are empty on Main Street, because your Main Street is dead, and make a regional cultural center. And they said, who would come? And he said, oh, who would come? So he spent the next year going around knocking on barn doors and talking to people in churches. He found farmers who had pretty good landscape paintings that they painted in the back of their barns. People had singing groups that actually went on the road some and performed. And next year he went back with 30 people. And the city council said, okay, we'll pay half the salary of the director of the center because she'll be our tourism director. But it's not a tourism place. But it's revitalized their Main Street. Their bed and breakfast, their cafes there, just that. But it's the idea that, this whole idea that somehow, I have a whole other set of papers critiquing export-based theory, which I think the empirical evidence from economists shows that they're, even at the level of nations, it's as often that domestic consumption drove exports than vice versa. It's really interesting. But I think that this is really important for arts and culture. You have to build for your own people. And if you're just a city, you go, oh, they have a performing arts center, we better build one, you're in trouble. And because it's just not fit to what people in your community are and what they want and so on. So that's the first thing. The gentrification thing, I am really sad, actually, that some of the best minds in the UK are really preoccupied with the gentrification question. Maybe some of you are in the room. I'm sure you'll be there tomorrow when I talk at King's College. Why? Because gentrification is just a part of real estate development. I can show you all kinds of places, including Manchester. There's a whole area of Manchester. There's no arts and culture there. It's all gentrified. It's all old textile mills made into apartments. And the same thing in the US. It's driven by the fact that real estate, to make money, really likes to build and rebuild and move around. That's, it's private property rights. That's the structure we have. And our land use planning and zoning in the United States anyway is not capable of changing that. And it's very hard. There are some ways of using land banks and other ways of preserving low-income housing and stability, and even for arts and cultural facilities, but it's not used that much, but there's a lot of talk about it. So I think that this conflation, this thing you've described, yeah, not just artists get displaced when places get gentrified, a lot of other people do too. And I think developers do use artists as a marker sometimes, but there's a lot of gentrification without that. And in London, frankly, your gentrification is being driven by worldwide speculation on real estate in London. And I hope you don't have a crash like we did. It was so, so terrible, because it's very scary. A lot of Americans are investing in real estate in London. It's all over the newspapers. And the more it's in the newspapers, the more people are going to be doing it. Not to mention the companies that are coming here because of the tax breaks, merging with other companies and so on and so forth. So that is my answer to that. I think that to the extent that our governments are involved in the Guthrie Theater, the state of Minnesota gave them $50 million. And there's not even retail in the neighborhood. There's not even a decent restaurant outside of, it's the stadium model, let's put all the restaurants inside of the building. There is actually one good one across the street, that's all. The city invested in a parking garage, and it lost so much money the first year that it had to sell it at a huge loss. I mean, to the extent that, and they gave the Guthrie the land for almost nothing, and a horrendous park next door that you would just wince if you saw it. Nobody uses it. Right on the Mississippi River. Okay. To the extent that city governments are responsible, they should be paying attention to it, all of this stuff. And this is one reason why I'm really not in favor of cultural districts. First of all, I think it implies that every other place in the city is not a cultural district, and that's just not true. And in some of the best cities, of course you have the Civic Center in San Francisco, which I think is a horrendous, accumulation, and Lincoln Center too. Even the Met last year broke through its back wall, because it had closed itself off from the neighborhood that, West Side Story was written about. And it's a fortress, Lincoln Center, and they're all on top of each other, and one of them's failed. The City Opera has failed. But even that now, people are really beginning to think, why do you need to cluster all your arts facilities? Why not have the Jane Jacobs model, which she wrote about in New York City? She said the great thing about Soho and Greenwich and Little Italy and is that, they're distinctive, they have porous borders, people feel invited to move across them and go visit and spend time in the other ones. That's a beautiful model. So every time I do a lot of consulting for cities, usually in the presence of large numbers of players, and I always say, why don't you use the idea of a mosaic, an urban mosaic? Because you've got a lot of capacity. You've got this over here, that there, and so on and so forth. And that makes for a wonderful city. If you've got good public transportation, or like Minneapolis, St. Paul, it's easy to drive anywhere because it's not that congested. People will do that. They'll go to a different place every weekend and have fun. So that's kind of my response to that. I think planning is really important. We don't do it very well around arts and culture in the US. But now, because of this money, like the NEA money required that you have one public sector agency and one nonprofit agency partnering around these proposals, and one of them had to be an arts agency, but not the other. So you could have city cultural affairs with a community development corporation or a healthcare center, or you could have the city's, workforce development or transportation department, getting together with some organization that did public art, for transit stations or something like that. So, thank you. Great insights. Yes. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Later on, sure. You mentioned the points of consumerism, but then you talk about the investment in the so-called infrastructure of consumerism, like building facilities or museums or whatever, like the McKnight. Isn't the importance of having a consumer market that actually consume the art more important than actually providing the facilities for it? And I can think of one example in the city of town of Margate. They built Tate Gallery. I don't know if that turned Margate into an arts mecca for artists. Whereas in London, you have one billionaire like Charles Saatchi that boosts the sales of some young artists and creates a gallery, and it swarms with people that consume art. And surely that's where the artists go there, is where they can make a living.
They can, but that group of artists you're talking to about is a very small percentage of artists in the United States. Very small percentage of artists. And I would like to underscore that visual art is the only art form that has the huge problem for artists that you don't have any ongoing property rights in your work. So it's a whole different kind of marketplace. Most other artists, actors, writers, performing artists, musicians, you know, they have ongoing property rights in their work. You know, if you compose for a film, you get ongoing, every time that film is shown, you get some money back. So in the visual art market, which has this small upper layer, you know, is the way you, but there are tons of other visual artists. I have a childhood friend, she makes $100,000 a year painting in her home, paints about 100 beautiful canvases a year. They're really aimed at architects. They're very architecty, very colorful. She puts them in her car. She drives around to high-end juried art fairs around the United States. She makes a really good income. So there are a lot of different kinds of visual artists. Yes, I think the market is really important, and some of the reasons, you know, like the Sheffield case that Peter mentioned, that was supposed to be a national center for popular music. It's beautiful. I have photos of it, but you know, it's like big drum-like looking buildings. It failed because they predicted 500,000 people a year would come. Only 100,000 came the first year. It closed within 15 months. And before it closed, they went to all the creditors, like the local businesses that had advanced money and stuff to them, and asked them if they would take a stake in it. And they all did, and they lost everything, anybody who put money into it. So fortunately for Sheffield Hallam University moved downtown, and they took it over as a student center. And that's great, except that it's got great sound, you know, recording equipment rooms and everything in it that aren't being used. But that's really an example. I think that problem, that's why, in a way, I think this the Guthrie Theater is having problems. I've written this wonderful critique. You have to get it off my website because Alan Brown and I are publishing it in an obscure Portuguese journal, but we have permission to make it into like an international journal of cultural policy piece. And what I really show in there is that it's just overbuilt. And because they couldn't fill it with their own programming, they started picking off smaller. We have like 80 theater companies in the Twin Cities, a vibrant market. Smaller performing companies that were in other rental spaces, and they couldn't turn down the marketing machine, but they'd only get one shot a year. But that really undercut the smaller theaters that relied on them for rent. And now they're mainly presenting. Not mainly, but they're doing a lot of presenting. So they're just bringing in UK and other acts and having them perform their plays in their theater, and that's how they're making money. So I think that's just, you know, the question of the market is a very interesting one. And, you know, yours are, as Peter said, more apt to be publicly funded. Ours are, even though I said $50 million that went to the Guthrie Theater, it's actually a $300 million project, and mostly it was wealthy people in the Twin Cities that paid for that. So, and you can't control it. People if they want to build an iconic building, which I think is also terrible architecture personally, but you can read my critique of that. Who else would like to say something?
I think there's some questions over here.
Yes.
Thanks very much. It was absolutely riveting. You spoke about one particular thing early on. You contrasted an engineer's need to justify their work, or a scientist, with the artist. You're sitting actually in the engineering building here, so we have to be a bit careful what we say.
You're lucky to be in engineering.
I know.
Planning isn't in engineering in the United States.
My equivalent dean of engineering would say he has to fight just as hard to justify his engineering as the arts do. Yeah. But there seems to be there's something quite different as well in here, which is that the way that artists work and the way that engineers may work may be two quite different, if you like, epistemologies.
Yeah.
Now I'm not sure if epistemology is actually the right word. The notion, it seems to me, for art is very often about appropriation. It's about taking what you were given and then thinking of something that you can do with that, what it is suitable for. The approach you very often have in more engineering type disciplines is a well-defined problem that you want to solve, and you design your way towards it. Now those are two quite different processes, and I wonder if you could reflect on the point at which they might come together.
Yeah. I think actually, just to start with that last point, there have been experiments at this. Xerox Corporation built this big research center in Silicon Valley. 25 years ago, they founded a thing to place artists in teams with engineers, and it failed. And a friend of mine who's now working in Minnesota wrote kind of a review of why it failed. And so it'll be interesting to see if this new 01 Garage thing, I think it's a different era now, so that's one thing. Those are really interesting characterizations. I have to think about whether I agree with the process in that, but let me underscore some other big differences. And let me also say that this insight comes from within our university structure. So my university president has 3 strategic initiatives on his desk, one in medicine, one in engineering, one in science. I tried to organize my arts faculty, including architecture and planning, creative writing, et cetera, to do the same, and half of them were totally uninterested. And the other ones were, but we never got that far. But also, just like you, I was the head of the Committee on Science, Engineering, and Public Policy for the AAAS in the US. I served for 6 years and was chair for 2 years. We never thought about that we would have to do this kind of economic impact study. We never did, you know, because mostly scientists and engineers, especially scientists in this case, they have pretty good jobs and they contribute to this organization that really does well. I mean, all over the American media are all these incredible stories about what scientists are doing for us. The thing about scientists and engineers, I've written a chapter, which we haven't published yet in this book that we have sort of moribund, because we're having trouble with the fit of the whole, but about how engineers, scientists, and artists are different as entrepreneurs. So if I showed you the migration rates for scientists and engineers, they're about as high as for artists, the numbers that move across state lines. And actually, I did some earlier work and showed how that was tied to defense spending a lot, and also how the big engineering, public engineering schools of the Midwest, you know, continually send, you know, graduates to the South and West, because that's where the companies are. But mostly scientists work in either laboratories or corporations where they're very protected from the market. And it's a big challenge for them to be entrepreneurs. And that's why so much of this effort to do spin-offs from university hasn't worked very well, because as soon as they, and Mia Gray, who's now a professor of geography at Cambridge, she did a great dissertation on the first 32 substances, biotech substances that came to market in the US. And she showed that although some of them had been developed at University of Washington, Seattle, and other places, they almost all ended up creating jobs and having property rights owned in the big pharmaceutical complex in New Jersey, because that's where they knew how to test and everything else. And the scientists were saying, like, oh, I can make a lot of money. I'm just going to sell to this big company, and then I'll be able to do some new research. And engineers also tend to work in big organizations. Some of them start their own firms. They often sell back. You know, they break off, they sell back. So artists' self-employment rate is 48%. Scientists and engineers are below the American national average, which was 8% in the year. Now it's just inched up a little. So I think the occupations and the markets in which they work are very, very different. And I also just think that infrastructure is just the most popular thing at any level of government in the United States. So that takes care of most kinds of engineers. It depends. And of course, our energy industry is like, lots of engineers work for that. Scientists, I think, have just great PR. I think their organizations have been fabulous. Like, here's the artist organizations, they're still petting this economic impact. Scientist organizations are just constantly, and they've trained scientists to be good communicators about their work. It's just amazing to me. So, very, very good questions. Was there something else? No, that was it. Great. And somebody else, yes. Who are you?
Samuel Sutner.
Hi.
I was just interested in sort of the part of your presentation when you're addressing diversity and sort of the racial class dynamics of it. And it seems to me the basis of art is that it's a normative concept, and I was wondering how would your work deal with something such as the rap emerging in the south side of Chicago, where there's gang violence, and like, how do you deal with this? Is it art, or how do you approach it?
Right.
How do you take?
Oh, that is such a good question. Well, you know, I mean, a lot of the artists I've interviewed are young, hip artists who are doing rap and other things, but they're not into skinheads or violence. I mean, you know, so yeah, you can have bad art and bad artists. In all my work, and in our census, artists are self-defined. So in our census, it's an occupational category, and you're asked whether you are an artist or not, and you're asked whether you're a musician or a performing artist. There's a bunch of different categories of designers, architects, and so on. It's really pretty good data, although I often wonder, like, you're actually supposed to answer on the basis of how many hours you work a week, not how much you make. So if you make more at your fancy restaurant job, but you work more hours in your artwork, you're supposed to put down artist. So I'm not really, the directions are not that good. And now we don't really have that question in our census anymore. We have this American Community Survey, which is a 1% sample. It's really problematic, but it's very good. And in surveys, I've done some very big surveys, and I've always defined artists, had it to be self-defined. And I never kicked anybody to the survey, but I had screens. And my funders, I tried out my funders one time. I said, how about if we say, You know, we ask people, in addition to, you know, are you an artist and what are your art forms? Many artists, by the way, have more than one art form, which is amazing. Like 2/3 of these artists in this big California survey said they had 2 art forms, like writing and, you know, music or whatever. But so I said, how about if we ask, you know, do you work at least 10 hours a week on your artwork? And do you share it beyond your family and close friends? And if people answered no to those 2 questions, then we didn't actually use our results in the survey. But everybody else we did, so it was self-defined. And one of the problems with that is that a lot of, you know, people who are doing cultural work in ethnic groups, they don't consider themselves artists. You know, like even Native American people, they have a hard time. And partly that's because of the roles that universities play. I mean, I am serving on this wonderful Strategic National Arts Alumni Project Board. I've been on it for 5 years. We've been running surveys of art schools graduates for 5 years, and it's totally fascinating. And it's all based on the school's cooperation, and it's all proprietary, really. We give it back to schools, but we've used a lot of it to do, you know, stripped of the identifiers of the schools to do a lot of things. So we've learned a tremendous amount about artists and what they're actually doing. And just like economists have always said, they have high levels of educational attainment, but most of them are making less than other people with the same level of, okay, but artists don't care. They're doing what they love. This is the thing they report back to us all the time. They do wish they got better training in school about the entrepreneurial part, and that's beginning to really change. And that's exciting. And even in engineering schools now, they're teaching engineers how to be entrepreneurs, in case you would want to do that. So, so that is, I think universities are still a huge problem. So there are about 5 or 6 amazing deans that serve on our board, and I've learned so much from them. And many of them feel like their faculty are still just at a place where they only just want to create the next great clarinetists or the great next person to get the, you know, work into the gallery in New York. And so it's very frustrating. And they even tell their students, don't go take that entrepreneurship class. People will think you're not really serious. So, I mean, and that's really a problem. But there are some schools where it's really changing. And but I think the problem about conventions very much is still a part of the problem of the way education is structured in the US around arts and culture, all the way from ballet to music to visual art, you know.
I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Yvonne.
Thank you very much, Anne. Yvonne Wright about School of Planning. I was very intrigued by your diagram with the different bar charts showing the dominance, the importance of the SMEs. That's hidden, obviously, in some data sets. Thinking about the kind of premises that those SMEs probably operate out of. Some obviously, I mean, it's obviously quite a broad category, so some will operate out of their own homes, some will operate out of community centres, some will operate, in the UK, certainly a bubble behind a pub.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you had any comments about what were the threats to the premises that are necessary for those kind of SMEs to operate.
Right. Well, space was a very big part of it. And again, all we did was interview 40 organizations, but we did a training. We had some really interesting people worked on. I didn't do too many of them because I wasn't living in California, but I did some of them. And I read every single one of them and asked them to go back if I felt the interviews. There were several student interviews and several faculty interviewers. So space is a very big problem. Almost nobody owns their own space. Only a very few of them worked out of their home. Many of them were ethnic or immigrant organizations. Some were just interdisciplinary organizations that had been, you know, put together around something else. One was a film collective and so on and so forth. So, but space is a problem because basically a lot of them were begging space off other organizations. And that meant that they would be displaced, you know, that they couldn't really count on using the space if there was something else going on. So that's just a big issue in the art world generally. So I don't really know about, there are some new forms of using older vacant buildings to create multiple kinds of spaces for artists. I mean, for artists, or small arts organizations, and that really helps them a lot. Some of them are actually part of larger social service organizations. This was fascinating to me. So this is a wonderful couple that went back to the Philippines. They were Filipino Americans and learned Filipino dance, and they came back. But at the same time, the guy became head of a social services agency in LA, a really big one. So now the sort of dance organization has merged in with the social service organization. And that's not that uncommon that a cultural organization that's doing arts and cultural stuff will also be doing some form of social service where they can get money for the state. That gives them some stability. They had many other problems. They had a lot of, management problems, not good management experience or turnover or, problems. Very few of them were actually democratic, but no nonprofits are democratic in that regard. But some of them were. El Centro Cultural, everybody, from grandmothers to teenagers votes. They all meet together. They finally had to get an executive director or name somebody because they wanted to get nonprofit status. But before that, they had, a decentralized structure where somebody dealt with the teaching, somebody with the dancing, and so on and so forth. So we do have a section in our California Arts and Cultural Ecology where we summarize these distinctive problems of these smaller organizations that we studied. And I hope that's a start. And I think we also published a piece in Grantmakers and the Arts Reader, I and this woman who's the executive director of the Association for California Traditional Arts, who's just amazing and has done a wonderful job in California of helping these kinds of organizations and helping interpret them to funders. Funders don't like to fund small organizations because it's too much hassle for what you get. It's small amounts of money, and often they need some kind of technical assistance or management wherever they like the medium size, and to some extent the really big ones. It depends a lot on the funder. But good question.
I'm anyone at the Minnesota University. I have a question regarding the understudied aspects in your presentation, particularly iconic flagship projects, buildings, structures. That's something I've been studying recently.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the contribution, potential and actual contribution of those buildings to innovation and sense of image, culture, place, sense of place. Whether they are visited, so literally people actually drawing people into their premises, or they might not be visited, hardly visited at all, like the Big Ben, for example, which is obviously Market London, marketing London, that's hardly visited by many tourists. The Opera House in Sydney, marking the whole continent.
Yes.
So I'm interested in the aspects of that something, innovation.
That's a little outside of my field, so maybe my friend David Porter, who's here, was an architect. I've never really completely understood architecture. I know that there is, some buildings have tremendous innovation going on them. Isn't the new Reed building at the Glasgow School of Art have some real innovation? But then they had to cut costs because Dave was just telling me today, because they couldn't afford like decent acoustics. Is that what you said? But yeah, I can think.
Not necessarily the architecture, but the relationship with the society and the culture and the architecture.
Yes, that's
what I'm referring to.
Right.
Not necessarily the architecture.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think actually the biggest question is really programming. What do you offer? And I can give some really quick examples. So, in the mid-90s, the Guggenheim in New York did an exhibit of motorcycles as art. And for the first time ever, they had lines down Fifth Avenue for blocks of guys in motorcycle jackets and gals in motorcycle jackets. And of course, it was completely panned by the critics. Oh, motorcycles. But now the MoMA has a whole floor of industrial design. So much for that. But, and another example is that the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, when it still had a separate lab theater in the warehouse district, which I really resent that also, that they pulled out this really theater that had been an anchor for this, smaller, still kind of grungy, area very close to downtown. They did a performance of Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed, which was her book about working in a Walmart, working in a motel as a cleaner, and working in a fast food thing. And they were packed. And they kept holding it over and over. And I was so lucky because I wasn't able to go during the first run. I went later and the place was packed with people with Union jackets on because somebody was finally using art to address their own experience. So I think opera has been very, very successful. In the US, it's partly because a lot of gay men have been fabulous opera supporters. But another reason is because they've commissioned new works. There have been 300 new operas written in the last 30 years in the US, starting around with Philip Glass's Satyagraha, which is an amazing depiction of the young Gandhi, his way of organizing, picking up people off the stage with a completely different Sanskrit text. So now a lot of these operas aren't performed again. We did one at Grapes of Wrath, commissioned in Minnesota. It was really incredibly wonderful. And so opera has done it partly by, not sticking to the old canon. It's harder to do that in classical music. There is contemporary classical music, but most people have a really hard time relating to it. So it's just interesting to me how I think buildings are important. And some buildings, actually in Alan Brown and my piece, he has written the part about saying that people are more demanding now of the venues they're in. And it goes back to Pierre Bourdieu's work, where he said that, because he studied people's, French people's responses to museums, and he said most people feel a profound sense of unworthiness when they go to a museum like the Louvre. And we all know kind of what that's about for some time in our life. So he's really arguing that there's a change in American culture and that institutions are having to respond to it. So that Walt Disney built the Disney Music Center, they hired someone to do this active arts program, and it wasn't really about getting butts in the seats, as we say. It was about filling the plaza with people dancing every Friday night to all different kinds of music. And it wasn't about the musicians, it was about the dancing. I have a whole rap about that. But Alan Brown has a lot more examples than I do, where he's really saying that more and more performance and artwork is being presented in breweries, in restaurants. You know, Merce Cunningham came and did his last, performance in a gravel pit in Minnesota. It was an amazing, amazing. I unfortunately wasn't there. So using different kinds of space and platforms where people feel more comfortable. Part of what people want is a feeling like they belong. And a lot of, operas and Broadway theaters are still making you walk in there and you feel like, oh yeah, there's the people who can really pay for the good seats and so on and so forth. So it's just really exploring that, and also more demanding. This is part of my talk. This is my talk for King's College tomorrow. People want to be more interactive with the creators. People even want to co-curate. How challenging is that for theater? That is really challenging. But it's happening in different ways. I've been cutting out articles, almost one every day, from some American newspaper about some, these three musicians are going to be asking people for ideas from the audience, and they're going to create songs right on the spot and perform them, and so on and so forth. So that is a very interesting thing. I want to also just say that I think this is really related to Larry Gross, and I had this in my original talk, but they just didn't have time. Larry Gross wrote this amazing piece called Art and Artists on the Margins about actually how we teach kids art in K through 12. And he argues that the main function of a grade school or high school art teacher is to teach most of us we don't have talent. That is their role. And that's why most parents don't care about their kids getting an art education in school. They don't think there's any occupational future. They think artists are some weird group of people over there on the reservation. That's the language he uses. And this is really totally true, and it's experience that most of us have had, and it's very hard to change that culture. So if you have that, then most people are going to feel uncomfortable, but that's changing. I feel like the younger generation is really, because we have this phenomenon of huge movements of young people to cities, they're making their own way, they're making their own art, they're doing it in different ways, and they're projecting it in buildings for free, and I mean, it's a changing world. And a lot of these arts organizations are struggling to figure out how to deal with it.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. Well, we'll have Dave two. We'll have two. Okay. I promise to not, I want to hear the question. I promise I don't have to say hardly anything.
All right.
Yeah. David Porter.
I'm David Porter. I was here at the Macintosh School at Glasgow School of Art when there was Fulbright distinguished visiting professors with us, which is wonderful. So it's great.
We had a great time.
But the point, you're going back to the question you raised, if you take Macintosh's building in Glasgow, it is in a sense a visitor's destination. Actually, it's not an art school, so you can't get many through. It's not a performance place, it's a working art school, so they have to measure the number who go through. But actually the rediscovery by Glasgow of Macintosh and the rebranding of Glasgow through Macintosh is very, very significant. Yeah, so if you get a taxi from Glasgow Airport into central Glasgow and say, I'm going to the School of Art, you get a 15-minute free lecture from every taxi driver, guaranteed. And there's an immense pride of all these people in the body, most of them haven't been here. Yeah. And that has spin-off.
That has spin-off.
I mean, you wouldn't know this, Anne, but the Turner Prize every year.
Yes, I do know that.
The great young artists.
Yes.
3 out of the 4 shortlisted were out of the Glasgow School of Art, and they're living up there.
Yeah.
I'm a Londoner, by the way.
Yeah, I
so
know.
I'm just but
Yeah.
actually, it's then to do with
Yeah.
the confidence of the place, its ability to hold on to its bright and able.
Yes.
And so I mean, all
And the
these
city of
things
Glasgow
actually-
making space for them. I think it's really provided some, in the merchant city, some wonderful space and been very encouraging.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm not going to say much about that because I'd like to hear the other questions or comments or whatever.
I'm Millie Tollison. I'm a student here at Bartlett, and I'm from San Francisco, so I'm interested in this presentation. And I'm increasingly concerned about pricing out of artists in the Bay Area and San Francisco itself, and also cutting of education programs in schools in the United States. But my question relates to kind of whether cities like San Francisco are properly acknowledging the economic revenue and benefits that artists bring to them in terms of tourism, and if cities should be doing more with that, how they can do more and really funnel that back into the arts community where it really came from.
Oh, that's good. Well, it's such a complex set of questions. I feel bad for everybody who's being priced out in the San Francisco, including my nephew who's trying to make a living there. And I don't want to go back to that question, but I will say that I think most cities don't care that much about artists. Some cities have done a really good job through zoning changes and sometimes through their redevelopment in creating space for artists. So, we have in Minneapolis the biggest nonprofit developer and owner and manager of artist live-work buildings in the United States. They're in about 25 different cities, and they've done a really wonderful job by using historic preservation and low-income housing tax credits, getting some bridge financing in the city, raising some money from foundations, and so on. But my city, Minneapolis, they still, if you go on their site, their website, to see what's offered in terms of arts and culture, they only have the big theater, the big symphony, the big, opera house, etc. You can't find anything else. So there's very, very little marketing, and that's partly because these convention centers all lose money, so they want to only direct you towards using the convention centers and these other large, flagships, which are probably still also costing them money in different ways. So, but some are different. Seattle has this amazing Seattle City Music program, which includes now live busking in the airports by musicians as an organized thing. And the Chamber of Commerce has embraced Seattle musicians and asked all their businesses to use Seattle musicians' music on their products and their marketing. You can read about it in my Creative Cities piece for the Otis College of Art Design and an earlier version in our Creative Placemaking NEA piece. So there are some cities are really getting it, but it's really, really hard. Because actually, if you listen to President Obama's State of the Union address, or you listen to your mayor's list of what's important to him, he's not going to mention arts and culture. So we have really a long way to go.
And I think we're going to have to leave it there.
Thank you.
You posed a question about who should do the research.
Yeah.
I think the answer is obvious, but I won't say it. Thank you very much for your contribution
Thank you.
this evening.
Thanks for having me.